want to kick off this episode?
Do I want to kick it off?
Yes.
You mean, how about them apples?
How about them apples?
You know it's September, and you know what that means. It's apple season. Yes, we know that it is. The leaves are starting to turn in fall, and the crisp fall air comes in. And what better to celebrate than apples?
There's a moment every year when I roll down my car window, and you can feel the air change to a cool, dry breeze. And immediately my mind goes to, I need to take my kids to Eckert's.
There you go. Go apple picking. Or how about having a little bit of mulled cider, right? Or making that good old classic American pie, right? So all of those things are what we're going to talk about today.
How about them apples?
How about them apples? Now, apples are traditionally associated with being American, right? You know, things are as good as American pie. And when we go through the alphabet, what's the first thing that is always the letter A?
Apples.
So it's funny because when you start to dive into, when you deep dive into apples, like I'm about ready to do, you're going to find out that apples really aren't what we think that they are.
What?
I know. So there is a figure that we have made into this legendary character that is associated with all of our apple growth. Do you know, Joe? Do you know who he is?
Is it Johnny Appleseed?
You are right.
Yes.
You are right. But little do you know that his name really wasn't Johnny Appleseed.
Well, what was it?
It was John Chapman.
Oh, that's boring.
I know, right?
That is not fun at all.
Well,
John Chapman?
Over the time of telling his story, his persona changed to Johnny Appleseed, right? And Disney did a really good job of changing it to the gentleman that wore the pot on top of his head, and he walked around with a satchel full of apple seeds, and he went around spreading the good spirit and glory of the apple.
So it's Disney's fault.
No, Disney's done a wonderful job of changing the viewpoint of how things really were in the frontier days. But, you know, apples really are, they were brought over from, they're sourced all the way back to Kazakhstan in Europe. But when apples came to America, they actually weren't the apples that we know and love today. They were apples that were very sour, and they weren't able to be eaten.
Like crab apples?
Like crab apples is a good modern day reference to it. There's actually very little reference to the frontier apples, the very beginning ones, because, well, I don't want to foreshadow too much, but there is some doom and gloom to this apple story. I know.
Oh, these apples are not all rosy.
No, they are not. But there is so many apples grown and changed and grafted throughout the course of the American history that there's actually a 7-volume encyclopedia set of watercolored.
You have these, don't you? You have them in your living room.
Well, I mean, I can't give all away my secrets, right? It's how I keep things,
Food nerd.
But there's actually a whole volume series that someone has gone through and archived all of the different varieties of apples that are available here in the United States and Canada. But let's get back to our good friend Johnny, right? So John Chapman. Okay. We'll refer to him as John Chapman by his given name. So he actually was quite the businessman. He was more of a gentleman that would pass the good fortune. So let's take a voyage all the way back to the frontier lands, right? Before the land was settled, people had agreements with landlords that if you were to have a homestead, you had to acquire a certain amount of trees and give a certain amount of profit of crop. So for example, like in the state of Ohio, some of the settlement homestead requirements is you had to have 50 apple trees and 20 peach trees in order to keep your homestead. So John Chapman took good advantage of some of this, and he would voyage out before the settlers came, and he would start his orchards. Now, he started them from apple seeds, so that part of his name is true, his process.
Okay. Makes sense.
And so essentially, like, he took full advantage of a lot of these apples being apple trees needed. So with that, these apples were not used for eating, like we've talked about. They were actually used to make cider. Yes, and cider was actually the beverage of choice back in the frontier lands. So it's been talked about how the frontiers walked around in a drunken daze because most of their liquor or most of their water consumption was about 10 ounces of cider throughout their whole course of the day. So to give you perspective, the average American drinks 20 ounces of water. So imagine we were Frontier, it'd be 10 ounces. Half of your liquid consumption would be cider.
Was alcoholic cider.
Yes, hard cider. And the reason why it was the beverage of choice was because water back then was not as cleaned or was not readily available, right? There weren't very few wells. It was
And because
full
the
of
government
bacteria.
forced you to have 50 apple trees
That
on
was
your
part of it too.
on your homestead.
Right? So apples became a part of building the American homestead. But then Prohibition came, right? And so what happened was cider was no more. And with that, the actual government went through and chopped down all of these trees that produced cider apples. So,
Womp
sad.
womp.
So with that, the Apple company was like, we need to rebrand. We need to figure out how to get apples back in people's lives. And that's where the slogan, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, came from.
Stop it.
No, it's true. That's true.
You are a wealth of knowledge.
I
Lydia
am.
Quinn.
I am. I'm, yes. These are all my party tricks right here, you know?
So there was no scientific basis in that statement that an apple a day keeps the doctor away. It was just early frontier marketing.
Exactly. And it's funny because when you start looking at marketing slogans from back in the day, it was very much like, a sandwich a day will keep your children at play. So it was always a fun little jingle.
I feel like you just made that up. That's not a real thing. But knowing you, it probably is a real thing.
I don't know any other way than to be truthful. So with that, over the period of time, apples have been grafted and there's been cross-pollination. And with that, we have the enormous amount of apple variety that we do. But the Red Delicious was the main apple source for a very long time, right? And if we think back to that beautiful quintessential red apple that was on every teacher's desk, or if you think about how, back to school, there's always that red apple.
Yeah.
That's because
Snow White was given a
red apple.
Red apple. It's the quintessential apple is that beautiful red delicious apple, which can I add is not delicious. Like, is that is at some point in time, did the red delicious apple just stop becoming delicious, or did other apples surpass it in deliciousness? What's the story?
I think it really came down to how the grafting happened. And for those that aren't familiar with what the grafting process is, essentially it's when you have a tree, you can cut off a limb of the tree and essentially reattach it to another tree. And in that process, you start creating new varieties. You start cross-pollinating, you can get multiple different varieties growing off the same tree. And just over time, we became better at grafting, better at farming. When we start looking at the science background of cross-pollinating, is when we started to get these varieties that we did. And when we look at apples, especially when you're making a pie, right? We want to have different varieties of starch and sugar and texture. And not only that, but think about the bite that you get from the apple, right? So those are all things that essentially are put into creating.
Well, they must have cross-pollinated all the joy out of Red Delicious apples, because there are apples today that surpass it in texture, surpass it in sweetness, in tartness, in crunch, in cooking ability. I mean, I one time made an apple crisp by accident early on in my cooking days with Red Delicious apples. Like probably early on in college, I was like, well, yeah, you get Red Delicious apples. That's what you do. And I peeled them and I sliced them and I made an apple crisp, and it was not good. And in researching it now, much later in my cooking life, realized that Red Delicious apples are good for, the only good thing they're good for is for decorating. I've learned they look nice in a bowl on a table during fall. Otherwise, they're not good. I think we've just cross-pollinated all the happiness out of Red Delicious apples.
Well,
but there are happier ones out there.
Okay. So what are those?
I mean, like everybody, when you think of like an apple that everyone goes to today, it's the Honeycrisp. Mm-hmm. Everybody seeks out Honeycrisp apples. I remember being at work 5 or 6 years ago when Honeycrisps really were kind of coming to the forefront and becoming a thing, when they were really expensive. They're a lot cheaper now. When they first came out, though, they were really expensive. And someone I worked with had a Honeycrisp apple in the refrigerator at work, and it was a really big Honeycrisp. And apparently she was really looking forward to eating it because somebody had taken it and eaten it by accident. Or I guess you don't eat it by accident, but they had taken it and I guess stole it and ate it. And she was beside herself because it cost like $4 for this one apple. And I was like, it's an apple. How does it cost $4? And that got me into thinking, okay, I need to try a Honeycrisp apple. And boy, is it worth $4. Now, obviously, it's worth a lot. It's not nearly as expensive, but Honeycrisp apples are delicious, and there are lots of varieties that really have hit that sweet spot or that tart spot that you want for specific needs. You have Cosmic Crisp apples, you have Fuji apples. I know we did a poll to our Chew in the Loo members on Facebook. What were the results of that?
Well, it looks like, just like you, Joe, the Honeycrisp apple was the big winner. Out of 100 votes, it came in at 57%. People love Honeycrisp. And then after that, we have the Pink Lady, the Gala Apple, and the Granny Smith. And then it just kind of fell to where we had a couple people here and there that liked other varieties.
I like a good Jonagold apple, too. That's one of those. It was a cross between a Golden Delicious and a Jonathan apple. It's now a Jonagold apple. You can get those over at Eckert's. Oftentimes, they're one of the later apple varieties that they have available. Really good in pie. And we'll talk about some pie stuff here in a minute, because how do you not talk about pie when you're talking about apples? And I also like Fuji's. If you're going to make or eat an apple, just crunch into an apple, besides a Honeycrisp, I think a Fuji is a great eating apple.
Yeah.
It's tart, it's crisp, it's those ones, not mealy. When you bite into it, you really get that sound. And I almost wish I had an apple here that I could just make that sound into the microphone for everybody. But everyone knows what I'm talking about when you make that sound with an apple.
Yes. Well, and it's funny when you talk about the Honeycrisp and you talk about price in the market. So Honeycrisp really didn't come into the market until the 90s, right? And as we're starting to see more and more varieties come into the marketplace, it's because over time there's been so much feedback that we want a certain variety or we want a certain quality, and that they've crossbred it enough. So when they first come out, they're very expensive. But the more that the market sees like, oh, we need more Honeycrisp, the more they start to make them, the more they start to do. So let's talk about ways to enjoy an apple, because I think that's another important way for us to talk about it, because we will be talking about how the hard cider is delicious. We have a wonderful guest for everyone here today to hear about the cider making process. But we did another poll with our Chew in the Loo community, and it looks like, it was a little tough. There were two top choices. Do you know what those are? Can you guess offhand?
I mean, I think making a pie is going to be one.
Yes.
People think making a pie is the thing you do with apples.
Right.
The American is apple pie.
It is. And the other one was just to eat them raw. Just eat them as in their purest form.
Yeah.
So, but
Makes sense.
Yeah, but there's a lot of other things you can do with it. I mean, apple butter's a big one, right? Apple butter does require a little bit of time, but it is delicious. And then caramel apples. Let's not forget about caramel apples.
Caramel apples are fantastic. Can we segue to happy apples for a moment?
Yeah.
And the fantasticness that is a happy apple, made out locally here in Washington, Missouri, by the way.
Yes.
We have a great segment from Living St. Louis a couple years ago that we'll post on the Chew in the Loo website here for you guys to watch about happy apples and the magic that happens at the Happy Apple Factory. It just sounds fun. I just want to go hang out at Happy Apples. And they're kind of the mass-produced candied caramel apple. You also have Merb's, puts out those cosmic apples that are, I mean, my God, they're just loaded with caramel and nuts. Those are two great examples of ways to enjoy a good caramel apple.
Well, and if you're ever looking for caramel apples off season, because I believe that Merb and Happy Apples only really come out during apple season, there is a local place in St. Charles, Kilwins, that has caramel apples all year round. Yes. Little did you know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you never know. In March, you just have the hankering for a caramel apple.
Exactly. But let's talk about apple butter, because I feel like it is sort of, one of those old-timey classic
Yeah,
apple.
apple butter, I feel like you forget about because it was one of those things that you learn about in fifth grade history when you got to the segment when you're talking about maybe like the Amish community. You talk about apple butter or any kind of community or culture that is taking time to make their food. You come to apple butter, something that's approachable and easy, but it really is delicious.
It is. I mean, it just shows you how over time that sweetness from the apple comes out. But not only that, but did you know that apples have their own natural pectin? And so pectin is that thickening agents that most fruit have. You can actually make your own pectin to make your own jam with. You just got to boil down apples and that natural pectin comes out into. But that's why apple butter is so fantastic because you don't have to add anything to it but just the purest form of apple and sugar. And a little bit of cinnamon. So, but you know what? You know who does apple butter really well locally?
Who?
Kimswick. The little town of Kimswick. So if you don't know about the Kimswick Apple Butter Festival, it has been going on since 1982. They actually have a pavilion devoted to this whole process. Their historical society will actually they peel and they prepare apples every day of their festival, and they cook it in an old school kettle on a wood fire. It's about a 6-hour-long process. And when they're done, they bottle it up, they jar it up, and you can buy it and take it home with you.
So, okay, when do they do this?
So it's usually the last weekend in October. So I think this year it's October 30th and 31st. So what a fun Halloween day to go out there.
Sounds like they make a cauldron full of apple butter.
Oh my goodness. They call all the local witches to come out and build their brew. But it is a big staple for their community too, because Kimswick actually runs 2 festivals. Their Apple Butter Festival in the fall, and in the spring, there's Strawberry Festival. And those 2 festivals bring in about 80% of the town's revenue. So last year when COVID happened, it really hit them hard that they weren't able to have their Apple Butter Festival. But this year, they're doing it.
No, it's on.
It's on.
How about them apples?
Yeah. So make sure you swing on out and do it. It is a day worth of visiting. They have over 500 to 600 different vendors that come out that all have different crafts and apple flavored.
500 to 600 vendors around apples.
Around apples. I know it's worth checking out. It's worth checking out.
That's how about them apples? My goodness.
Yeah, but you know what the other thing is if you're like, that sounds like a little too much for me.
No, it sounds amazing.
It does. But if you're like, I want to go and get apple pie, you can still go to Kimswick because they have the Mile High Levy apple pie, this famous, huge, gigantic apple pie that they sell at the Blue Owl restaurant there. And it has been served there since 1993. It was the big flood that happened sort of inspired Mary, who runs the restaurant, to make this the signature apple pie. And it is legendary. Even Oprah has
It is
noted
legendary.
it. Yeah.
I know that it was on Oprah.
Yeah.
I don't know how I know that, but I know that it was on Oprah.
So, but she uses
Everybody gets Mile High apple pie. Yeah.
good old Oprah.
I love it. So okay, so Kimswick is one option. So that's if you're setting your sights, real big to celebrate apples.
Sure.
So let's set our sights a little lower. So I've got my kids. We want to do something apple fun. Mm-hmm. Obviously, what we're going to want to do is go to Eckert's. I think that's the I don't want to just make an apple pie, but I want to do something apple. I want to take a day or at least a couple hours. Eckert's is usually the place to go. They've got a couple of different orchards throughout the St. Louis region. My family we tend to like to go to the one up in Grafton. Mm-hmm. I like the drive up the River Road, up to Alton, up 367. You get to drive up the River Road. It's just a beautiful drive up there, driving through Grafton and then up. It's always a fairly easy drive to get there. It's never super crowded. They've got it laid out really well. And they've just got it down to a T on how to get you out into the orchard, let you pick apples. You can eat whatever you want when you're out there. I love that. My kids love that. I love taking pictures of them just engorging themselves on apples out in an apple orchard. There are a few things as fun as watching, your children just run wild, understanding that they can pick whatever they want and eat whatever they want. So if you don't want to go up to Grafton, they also have a farm in Belleville and in Millstadt. Those are other options for you as well, all easily accessible from the St. Louis region, all nice couple-hour trips for you and your family, or you and your significant other, or just a solo trip. If you want to go and hang out in an apple orchard, they're around.
And Eckerd's isn't the only option. So look, and doing some research and looking at other areas, there is at least 5 great apple orchards within a 25-mile drive from St. Louis. Yeah. Oh. So there's Mills Apple Farm in Marine, Illinois. And then we have Centennial Farm in Augusta. And there's Thierbach Orchard in Marthasville. And that's where I usually go to get my blueberries. And I will tell you, they're delicious. So, but the apples are great too. But if you want a whole list of all the orchards that are within a 25-mile radius, make sure you go to Chew in the Loop, because we'll have that list on there for you to make sure you can see what's available and what apples are available at the orchards.
Yeah, we'll post it on our Facebook page too.
All right.
Cool. All right, so we've gone to Kimmswick. You've gone all day. You've got a day of apples. Mm-hmm. We've gone to our local apple orchards. You've got a couple hours of apple time. Now you're like, you know what? I don't have time for all that stuff. I just need to make a pie, or I just want to make a recipe, or I just want to dabble a little bit in apples. And so I just need to get some apples. I'm going to pick them up at the store. I need to make something. Let's talk apple recipes. Let's talk cooking apples. Let's talk eating apples and consuming apples.
Okay.
So,
what do we want to start?
What are you making? What if someone says, Lydia, here is a bushel of our best apples, whatever variety it may be, make us the best thing you make with apples. What are you making?
So the first thing that always comes to my mind when I make an apple pie, and keep in mind, folks, I am a little extra when it comes to cooking.
Just a little.
Just a little. So I actually will make a white cheddar crust apple pie. And with my apples that I pick for my apple pie, I actually use 3 different varieties of apple. And I always encourage anyone to kind of maybe think about that, because there's a lot of great varieties out there. So the Honeycrisp is always one that I pick, because it's got that great texture and it won't disintegrate when I cook it, but it adds just this nice sweetness to it. The other apple I pick is always the Granny Smith. Granny Smith is your classic choice for apple pie, just because it has that really solid texture to it. But it also has just really tartness to it too. So people that, when you look at recipes that are 100% apple pie with your Granny Smith, there's a lot of sugar in there. So if you kind of mix your different apples varieties, you can pull back on the amount of sugar that you do with it. And then the other one that I put in there is the Jonathan apple. Jonathan apples are a little bit more delicate, but they also have a really great sugar content too. So mixture of those 3. And then instead of cinnamon, I use chai spice for my apple pie. So it adds, outside of cinnamon, we all use cinnamon, but chai is a spice blend that's usually cinnamon, cardamom. It's got cloves in it. It has turmeric, a little bit of black pepper. So it's just got this really nice, full, fun flavor variety.
Like a full fall flavor.
Yes.
I love
but then
it.
apple goes really great with pork. Right? So, you can.
Oh yeah, go there. It's
right.
not just a dessert.
It's not just a dessert. It's savory, right? You can take a pork chop and do a beautiful pan-seared pork chop in your cast iron. Pull your pork chops out. Take some apples that you've sliced and let those cook in the residue that's left over from your pork. Add a little bit of Dijon mustard, add a little bit of white wine, let those all cook down and simmer together, and you've got a nice glaze to put on top of your pork chops. That's one of the ways to go with it.
I always like cubing up apples with some diced onions and butternut squash.
Oh, that's
and with some sage and some cinnamon, and letting that roast in my Dutch oven with like a big pork roast on top. Oh, and letting that fat from the pork roast drip down into it. Oh,
yeah.
And just for a couple hours.
And apples are great too. One of the other things is you can take it with squash, right? So squash is one of those really great seasonal produce items. A lot of people not sure what really to do with them. Roasting is the great way to go. But slice up some apples and throw it in with your squash, because it helps brighten up that squash flesh, and it helps make sure that flavor between the savory and the sweet blend really well together.
Awesome. Well, my go-to apple recipe whenever somebody hands me a bushel of fresh apples is Ina Garten's apple crisp recipe. I'm going to go off the range a little bit. It's not a PBS food recipe. It's not. Ina Garten doesn't appear on 9 PBS, so ding me for that. But Ina Garten's recipe is one that uses a lot of lemon zest and orange zest and juice in your apples when you dice them up, which bring a real brightness to it. And then it's just this real easy, buttery, oatmeal-y crust that you put across the top, and then you bake it, and it gets real caramely and just crumbly on top, and you have to have it with ice cream. You have to serve it warm, and you have to put a dollop of vanilla ice cream on top. It's just a must. You have to. It's a requirement. It does not complete the recipe if you don't do it. I've tried multiple recipes. I've made multiple apple pies. It is far and away a superior recipe. Cinnamon, nutmeg. I'm going to try it sometime with chai spice. I like that idea to give it an extra little depth of flavor in there. But it's fairly basic. We'll post it in the blog. We'll add it to this podcast page on the website so you have a copy of the recipe or a link to it. But really, anytime I make it for my family or anytime I take it somewhere, it's my go-to fall recipe, and people just go crazy over it. And it's fantastic. I mean, and it's Ina Garten, so you know that it's solid, it's well-researched, and it's going to be easy to do because she'll say, if you don't have that, store-bought's okay, is always her thing.
Store-bought at the gourmet store is okay.
But no, you can make it with anything that you buy at the regular grocery store. It doesn't require anything crazy from the Hamptons. But it's simple, it's easy, and it's delicious, and it's always my go-to.
That's awesome. Well, I will tell you my other go-to is I love a Pennsylvania Dutch apple pie, and the American Test Kitchen put out an amazing recipe. They actually have a really wonderful YouTube clip that not only talks about the Dutch apple pie, but what's the best vanilla ice cream to put on top of your apple pie.
Oh, see, they're doing real work over there.
They are. They're doing
They're
all the work.
They're not just giving you the recipe, but they're saying, we know you want vanilla ice cream, so let's
tell you the best.
Tell you the best one too. Oh, okay. I love it. Well, it sounds like we've got a lot of work to do with apples. We've got lots of recipes. We've got some apple picking to do. We've got an apple festival to go to down in Kimmswick. Apples are in season, St. Louis. Get out there, get them, pick them, cook them, eat them.
Drink them.
Drink them.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Let's talk about drinking.
I totally forgot about drinking.
Cooking and eating, but I think Russ from Brick River Apple Cider, Hard Cider, is going to tell us how we can best drink apples.
Right. We'll be back in just a moment with Russ to talk about cider.
We are here with our very first guest, and we are super excited to introduce him to you because his story is incredible. And not only that, but he provides us with a really amazing, unique service here in St. Louis. So let us welcome Russ John of Brick River Cider Company. So welcome, Russ.
Good afternoon.
All right. So one of our big things is your food journey. So tell us about how you got to being the cider maker that you are.
So I was a Midwestern farm kid, grew up on the farm, went off around the world, several other places, got into entrepreneurial ventures. And it always said that eventually one of my entrepreneurial ventures was going to start touching on the farm and the land. We had gotten a homestead actually in southeast Nebraska after the Civil War and raised apples for the last 150 years. I kicked around a few ideas. At one point, I was going to have a bird seed company because we could grow a lot of grain. And thankfully, I talked myself out of that and came into something a little more fun. And so we make hard cider from regional fruit, all grown here in the Midwest, not necessarily grown by me, but grown around names you would know here in the Midwest.
So you grew up on an apple farm?
I grew up on a farm that also had apples, which is sort of how old traditional farms worked. Everybody was very diversified. Everybody had their grains, they had their livestock, they had their orchards, we've now kind of gone into a world where it's a lot less diversified now, but that's sort of the old school way. If you wanted to eat it, you better raise it.
I find something very romantic of the idea of being able to just like run out and pick apples in your own orchard in your backyard. I've always dreamed of having apples in my own yard, or a grove of apples, or an orchard somewhere of a couple trees that you could just run out and pick. It's always a dream of mine.
It's romantic until you have like 100 trees that you have to go out and pick, right? There's a little bit more work to
Or you're fighting the animals
Yes.
for your precious fruit and stuff like that.
When you're actually trying to sell it to make a living.
Yeah.
Take some of the romance out.
I can understand that. I can understand that.
Well, great. Well, you were very gracious to let us come and see your production. So not only do you produce the cider there, but you also have a bar inside so people can come and see the production that's happening as well. So tell us a little bit about making cider for anyone that is curious.
So cider, many people think of cider more akin to beer because we package it and we market it more like beer. But cider is really winemaking. It's just the fruit is apples instead of grapes. So we don't brew anything, and we're not a brewery. Cooking apple juice would give you apple jelly, not cider. So it's all a cold process, making wine, and then in the end, packaging it more like a beer and marketing it more like a beer. But it's really a lower alcohol apple wine.
So really, I could say that I'm a wine drinker.
You could.
Hot dang. Okay, I like that.
It now elevates it to a whole new level.
Makes me feel a little bit better when
More sophisticated.
when my wife yells at me about why I don't drink wine. You know, I can say, actually, I do. You know, Russ from Brick River told me that I am a wine drinker.
Cider is wine. Perfect. And so it's basically just apple juice, water, and yeast are the three
not
main
even really
components.
water. We take the apple juice as it is. It
All right.
comes in looking very much like the brown stuff you buy in a plastic jug in the fall at some of the orchards.
Sure.
You know, it's all brown and aerated and oxidized, and that's the way it comes to us, and then we ferment it and take it on down the road from there.
So I'm sure it's a little more difficult than that, though. Like, I can't run to the store and grab a jug of apple juice from the shelf and some Fleischmann's yeast from the grocery store and go home. And I mean, I probably could make some version of cider, but it would
Sure.
not be as good as what you're
It's
making.
like prison juice.
You could grab some Welch's grape juice and turn it into wine, but I wouldn't necessarily say you'd want to drink it. It will produce alcohol, and it
Yeah.
will technically be wine, but it might be the stuff you'd want to have very late in the evening after you'd had something else
Yes, it will knock you
that you
off.
could taste.
Fair enough. So walk us through kind of then what is your process? What kind of love and journey goes into Brick River cider?
So first we work all from fresh fruit juice. That's actually not the way most cider in America is made. Most cider in America is made from fruit juice concentrates or extracts, where they're buying something that looks like that orange juice concentrate your grandmother always had, and they're rehydrating it with tap water and then turning that into cider. That's the way all the big national companies do it, which, as you think of it now as wine, I've yet to find the winery that really makes a big deal about they make their wine from the best grape juice concentrate money can buy, right? It's about the land and the growers and the earth. So we work with nothing but fresh juice that's all within a one-day trucking radius of us. We work Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, Nebraska are kind of the 4 states we're bringing things from right now. Comes in as fresh juice. They feed the dry matter to their livestock out on the orchards. Takes us about 6 weeks to turn it from that fresh juice into the canned hard cider that you'd see at the stores.
All right, cool.
Well, and not only does he have just your classic hard cider, but he has a whole portfolio of ciders, seasonal flavors, as well as the spritzers for the low-carb, low-calorie gal out there. So,
Gal or guy.
gal or guy, you're right. Spritzers are for
Equal
everyone.
opportunities.
Spritzers are for everyone.
21 and over, please.
But I think the one that I was most just impressed with was the one that I think would steer any bourbon drinker, right? So some people usually don't associate.
My ears just perked up.
Right. But you have a cider that you have let sit in a bourbon barrel or
Yeah,
it's a
so
whiskey barrel?
we took our dry cider and we aged it for 6 months in some rye whiskey barrels that we got out of Iowa, and Picks up a nice vanilla and oak and the char from the barrel and the rye. And it's very nice.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I had a bourbon drink on the rocks when I was sipping it.
Hot dang again.
There you go, right? So winter there. So real quick, let's as we are talking about, you mentioned dry, but I think it's important to talk about how cider, just like wine, has different portfolios. You have sweet to dry, and so does your cider, based off of your varieties that you have, right?
Yeah, we started with, I think in 2018 with 4 different flavors. I think we're up to 12 now. We don't necessarily make all 12 of those year round. Some of them are part of the season and then gone and back again. But yes, it spans the range from bone dry, almost brut champagne dry, up to semi-sweet is where we stop. Kind of, we don't probably make anything dessert wine sweet. We sweeten with fresh fruit juices. We don't just load in syrup sugar that would let it go infinitely sweet. That's kind of not our style. So
Yeah. So it's not like Angry Orchard, right? There's actually an art form to your cider.
They know their business too, so they have their market, I have my market. We have some overlap, but we're not really shooting at the same thing at the start.
Sure.
Cool. Very cool. What's your most popular flavor or most popular cider?
So our biggest seller is still our Homestead, which is an unfiltered, just semi-sweet apple cider. It was the first thing we launched. It's still number one. It's got a couple of newer things on its heels now. We won several medals in 2019 when they were still doing competitions for our Sweet Lou, which is a blueberry lavender apple cider. If you were within 2 blocks of 20th and Washington and were making lavender tea that day, you know it.
Awesome. And you have a fall variety too we just were there making a TikTok for this.
Yeah.
We'll talk about your seasonal one.
We just put it in package. We call it Autumn Spice. It's a semi-sweet. Apple's the only fruit, but then we have all the things that make you think fall. We have clove and cinnamon and nutmeg and allspice and a little brown sugar. And,
there's no pumpkin in there, is there?
There is no pumpkin.
It's not a pumpkin spice cider.
It is Joe approved.
It's Joe approved.
The
Okay.
fall flavors.
There is no pumpkin.
Okay.
But
no pumpkin spice in my cider.
Pumpkin pie might taste like most of the things I just rattled off more than it tastes like pumpkins.
Yes. So let's talk real quick about cider houses, right? So there's a new resurgence of cider that's coming out there. How many are there really in the United States? I'm not asking for a number. If you have a percentage.
No, I mean,
sure.
I've seen numbers that there are now upwards of 1,200 cider making, commercial ciders makers in the country, where that 15 years ago was a number that was probably in double digits, less than 100. The cider reintroduction to America started probably 15 years ago, did start more in the apple growing regions on the coasts, and has kind of been working its way around the country to where I think most big metros now have some craft cider maker into them. There's a few that still don't.
Is most cider produced in the United States, or is it a local product? Or
So most of the cider that's consumed in America is made in America, but the culture, I guess, that kind of kept cider alive the most, the British Isles actually make like 60%, 60% of the world's cider, and America makes about 3%.
Really?
So the typical person in Great Britain drinks about 10 times more cider than the typical American.
I would fit in very well in Great Britain.
Maybe you're British and not Italian.
Maybe I'm British and not Italian.
I think
No, I'm Italian, and there's no doubt about that.
I think a company named Bulmers advertises, with all due respect to Anheuser down the street, that the largest fermentation vessel in the world is actually one of their cider fermenters.
Oh,
bigger than anything we do here.
very cool.
For the cider drinker, a person looking for Brick River cider, where exactly can they find it? Is it available at grocery stores, or just come?
If you're listening to this within the ring of 270, we're widely available, probably in every grocery store and every liquor store you're going to find. as you travel outside the 270 ring, it gets a little dicier. We're in all the big name places you'd think, Schnucks and Deerbergs, but it gets a little spottier outside of 270. We're in the process of an expansion so we can start spreading the cider gospel a little further than just St. Louis.
Very cool.
So you'll be the next Johnny Appleseed of cider.
Maybe.
Well, what kind of food would you cook with cider? So just like a wine pairing, if you were to design a meal with one of your ciders, what would it be?
So we, like at the restaurant, we'll work with fish, we'll work with chicken, we'll work with pork. We actually don't serve a hamburger or any beef in the place.
Really?
It's a little lighter, and it does tend to go a little better with chicken, pork. So that's the direction we go. The stronger things, if you put a big, strong steak with it or something, it's not going to stand up the way a fat Cabernet would.
Yeah, it sounds delicious, though.
It
Pork
does sound
chop
delicious.
with some apple cider. You could boil it down and make an apple cider glaze.
Now you're speaking my language right
We have
there.
a few people pretty fond of. We actually brine some chicken wings in cider and garlic and some spices overnight. Flash
that's on
fry
your
it and
menu.
toss it in a little red hot riplet just to give it a little fun.
Yum.
So
Veronica, our producer, is her mind is exploding over there. Oh, that sounds delicious.
Right. I know. And then, so when we talk about the cider being made, and I have a note here, that it really takes 600 tons of apple to make.
well, we're using this year probably around 600 tons of apples.
Wow.
So we are to visualize for somebody where we start with a tanker truck of apple juice. So the big tanker trucks that you see driving down the road tend to specialize in, some of them are in fruit juice, some of them are in milk, some of them are in gasoline, but it's one of those big tanker trucks. That's about 6,000 gallons, and that's about 36 tons of apples. And we get 36 tons of apples right at every 3 weeks.
It's a lot of apples.
A lot of apples.
How about them apples? All right. Well, I think we have outdated all of our apple questions. So
We are just about all out of apples.
yeah, there you go. Well, Russ, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
We
you.
look forward to definitely indulging in some definitely really good seasonal cider.
Heck yes.
Yes.
We appreciate
Check
it.
them
Thank
out.
you,
Thank you.
Russ.
Yeah.
Lydia, I don't know about you, but that sounded amazing. Russ clearly has some good stuff going on down there at Brick River Cider, and it's not just the cider. I mean, he was talking about those chicken wings that they brine in cider and then have red hot riplets dusting on them. I mean, it's not just a drink down there at Brick River Cider, which I was not really aware of at the time. So that surprised me, and I'm excited about that. And to know that there's 12 or 14 different varieties of cider. I always thought of cider as just, there's cider, there's, Angry Orchard or one or two. But to know that there's a local cider company churning out variety like that is really interesting.
It is. How about them apples, though,
How
Joe?
about them apples?
Well, listen, Chew crew out there, we really want to encourage you to share your pictures with us of where you go to apple pick or your apple recipes. We're all one big community that loves to eat and support our St. Louis local.
And apples are in season, folks, so get out there.
And stay tuned. Join us next month as we talk about a lot of really delicious things happening around St. Louis. And Joe and I are going to open it up about what really scares us with food.
It is October.
So stay tuned and continue to share and like Chew in the Lou. Your hosts for the Chew in the Lou podcast are Lydia Gwynn
And Joe Prosperi.
and produced by Veronica Moheski. This is a production of 9 PBS in St. Louis.